Okay, so our topic today is really to provide an overview for communicating in science. Why, what, why, and how, what communication in science is, why it's important to communicate effectively, and how can you make your work more compelling and accessible to others. And we're going to touch upon a few topics and also engage you in some thoughts regarding particular aspects of this. So some would argue that communicating in science is really an art, and actually a science is emerging in the art of communicating science. So what is the art of science communication? And what are some of the key attributes and characteristics of effective communicators? What best practices or models exist to optimize communication? And why is science communication so important and vital, especially in this current environment? And how can you acquire and modulate the requisite skills to effectively communicate science to a range of listeners? And that's really our topic to touch upon today, but also to revisit elements of this throughout the next month. So we've already learned a little bit about Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's a world-renowned astrophysicist and director of the Hayden Planetarium, who has compelling characteristics. And I want you to start to think about what is it about Neil deGrasse Tyson that makes him so compelling? And what does he do that allows you to embrace, or for so many people to embrace, an otherwise difficult topic of astronomy and astrophysics to really get your hands around? So hold those thoughts for a moment. Carl Sagan, also an astrophysicist who is an enthusiast, who started a series called Cosmos on PBS, for those of you who may recall, or for those of you who don't, you can Google it and check into the past. And he was also an academician. He was a Harvard graduate and taught at Harvard and went on to be a full professor at Cornell. He had some of those similar attributes. One highlighted here in terms of his enthusiasm that he was able to project, and actually served as a role model for Neil deGrasse Tyson. So again, think about this. If you're familiar with Carl Sagan at all or watched any of, think about what those characteristics and attributes were. And we'll come to that in a moment. And then Bill Nye, here speaking at a big think, a trained mechanical engineer who demonstrated methods of scientific experimentation and really was the first to make that appealing to the public. But why did he catch on? So what are some of the characteristics that these three individuals and others that you might think of, some of the celebrities that we highlighted in our little fun poll everywhere, what are some of the positive attributes that you would recall as actually being important? Somebody want to give me some ideas? Okay, charismatic. We'll correct my spelling later.
Concise. Accessible.
And by that you mean?
That they all have very great tips and taking very high level concepts and bringing them very
Right, so reducing the topic to the essence.
correct.
Okay.
Not condescending.
Not condescending. Descending. Okay. Absolutely, not condescending. Very important.
One of the they tell you that they're not sure what the answer is right up front.
Right.
And I think that's
So how can we pose that? Somebody?
transparent.
Transparent and inviting. Inviting for other opinions. Other thoughts? excited about the subject, enthusiasm, supportive, how about curiosity, being able to share in that wonderment. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the perhaps not so wonderful attributes that people may have that are not really embodied in these particular individuals. But what makes for a poor communicator? Jargon. Why is jargon thought not to be very helpful in communicating? It assumes that you know everything. Or what else does it assume? What else does it project based upon that comment, which you're absolutely right about? It projects an air of superiority, because if you don't know the jargon, you're not in the in crowd. So by using jargon, you're really, in a sense, without intention, being condescending, and can be perceived that way. Arrogance. Unrelatable. Oh. Repetitive, right. So by awkward, you mean not the tone or the language used is not relatable, because there are some individuals who may be awkward appearing, but actually can be very communicative. So I think that whoever said that probably meant the latter.
Disorganized or tangential?
Okay, yes. I'm sorry, what? So it depends on what the goal is. But your point is well taken. So let's put that as lack of sufficient detail. Is that fair? Lack of sufficient detail, or it really depends on, so, and this is a debatable issue, right? It depends on who the audience is, who the listeners are, and what you're trying to accomplish. What is it that you want the listener to come away with? So today, I'm not prepared to give you specific instructions, nor am I necessarily the right person on how to actually give a TED Talk. But there are important principles, and we can highlight that to raise your awareness. My goal today is really to raise awareness. So it depends on what your goal is and what you want the audience to go away with. What's their homework assignment, in a sense? So I think that, and I'm not mentioning Neil deGrasse Tyson as the be-all and the end-all in appropriate or the best communication in science. It's one example But I think what he has done, and the Carl Sagans and the Bill Nyes of the world, have raised an awareness of science to get people interested in the fact that it can be fun and exciting. But you're right, they may not know any of the specific facts, but the fact of the matter is that more people are actually interested. And that's really their goal. Their goal in these realms is not necessarily to make other people cognizant of all the detailed vocabulary of astrophysics. So it depends, I think, what your goal is and what the audience is, but your point is extremely well taken, that at what point are we minimizing or belittling science for the expense of, a Hollywood-like presentation? And so there has to be a balance. But by looking at these different techniques, each of us can draw some lessons, perhaps, for how we can incorporate some of the principles that we think are actually useful to more effectively reach a range of individuals, depending on who we're trying to impact or influence. So I think that's really the purpose. But your point is well taken. So let's put it, too much showmanship. Does that better capture what you're trying to say? Okay, good. Fine, good, okay. Yes?
I'd say bias as well.
Right. Okay. Good, excellent. Okay. Yes.
I think recently I've gone through training to be a docent in the museum, and I think it applies to this. The assumption is that the people who are present are already interested in the topic, and therefore you have to show sufficient respect for what they're bringing to the situation. And I think that's one of the things that the best communicators do. So respect for the audience, I think, is an important component.
Yes. I'm sorry. Say that again.
Culturally competent.
I think this gets to the context in which you are speaking and knowing the audience and the perspective and the diversity of perspectives that are brought to bear on a particular topic, which gets back a little bit to our jiu-jitsu question, to really not necessarily agree with, but try to understand the perspective and the context and the cultural environment in which an individual may come that may make them more prone to have certain beliefs or disbeliefs that they still value, and you're trying to persuade otherwise by communicating the importance of a scientific topic. Okay, great. Okay. So some of the key attributes of effective communication in science, which we've been discussing, is getting your message across, selective content to impart. There's often a tendency to try to provide too much information and too much detail. So selective content is really critical. And in presentations to our colleagues, we often talk about the elevator talk, an abstract presentation where you have to be very succinct, fixed number of slides, less less bullet points on a PowerPoint presentation, gets to this whole notion of selective content, be it for a scientific or a lay audience. many of you brought up this notion, but is really critical, is capturing your audience's attention. So knowing your audience and speaking to that audience in order to capture their attention with a diversity of approaches is thought to be a key attribute. Ensuring understanding while respecting, a key component that Sandy brought up and many others alluded to in their comments. And encouraging your audience to do something with the information imparted, which gets back to our discussion about Neil deGrasse Tyson, is do you want the audience to just remember the concepts? Do you want them to be able to apply this? Do you want them to provide feedback? So what you want the audience to do with this information will impact how you actually go about communicating it and the level of detail that you're going to provide, in addition to the nature of the audience itself. And this just is a summary of key topics that complement the very terrific list that you generated that really is derived from a broad review of the literature. So there are a number of models out there for optimizing communication, and this is referred to as the gradient model, which really is this alliance between science and participants in science and the public, which is to focus on enhancing communication skills of the scientific community, which until recently really hasn't been paid attention to. And at the same time, trying to enhance scientific literacy among the public to allow for optimal scientific communication. And so scientific literacy and scientific communication really go hand in hand, but the way in which we go about doing this can be different, but have to be taken into that context. So this gradient model implies that there's work on both ends of the spectrum that will allow us to optimize communication in science. And we'll be having some discussion of effective principles for scientific literacy, for partnering with stakeholders and communicating effectively through community engagement from experts in that arena. And we'll be focusing also on a variety of communication skills from Marie Norman and others that will really further enhance your own capabilities to be effective communicators of this field. So what's the problem? And we've been talking about why is this important? It has to do with the fact that there is a problem in science. And that is that we have scientists who communicate and we have the public that communicates. And this is a cartoon and it's not as simplistic as this, but we talk about apples and they're talking about oranges, and the two do not necessarily arrive at a common ground. And there hasn't been, in recent years, there's been a renewal of an active desire to have proactive communication with individuals who are less familiar with the language of science, as opposed to remaining separate and talking among themselves. And that really wasn't seen as a feature or a required skill set among people training in science or in medicine. In recent years, that is certainly integrated into curriculum in medical schools and is beginning to integrate into curriculums in graduate schools. Yes?
I just wanted to point out there are a number of things that we learn in medicine that aren't supported by science. For example, if you look at all the studies looking at high cholesterol, there has never been a study that showed that reasonably high cholesterol, 300, 400, has any effect on your overall health or when you die. We simply assume that cholesterol is bad because of where then we get measured. And every study has had an indeterminate result, but they still said in conclusion, we still feel that cholesterol is terrible for you. And what got into the news was we still feel that cholesterol is terrible. But if we look back at our own studies, we can change how we think. one of the most important things we can do in terms of communicating with ourselves.
Excellent point. Excellent point. So disbelief in science, just a few little fun or not so fun facts. The National Science Foundation found that 25% of American respondents answered that the sun orbits the Earth. A recent AP GFK poll indicated that 4 in 10 American adults doubt evolution. Over half aren't confident that the Big Bang took place. Just under 40% don't believe that pollution is causing climate change, and 15% don't believe in the efficacy or safety of vaccines. And some of this may be valid. I'm not passing any judgment. I'm just telling you, yes. Could you speak up a little bit? Yeah.
So much of our funding depends on these people who know nothing about what we do. Isn't this more making rather than worrying about educating the 6 out of 10 people who doubt evolution? Is it really going to ever enter their mind? Or is it that we need to stop relying on our work? Because so much about the translational component and I hate that and getting this huge sample size, but distraction doing what we really need to do.
So I think those are common feelings. I think that the notion here today, every person is going to find their appropriate avenue for expressing how they want to enhance awareness and make people understand the value of science in specific realms. But I think that part of impacting or influencing any debate or any disbelief is understanding where it comes from and how to begin to effectively communicate about science. So one of the issues is that we haven't done a very good job as an academic community effectively communicating or engaging the public. It's only been a recent entry, and it's only recently come to the consciousness of people in science. And even if, as I said, even if you look at the average graduate school, only recently, this past year, we had a course on communication in science led by Paula Claxton, who will be speaking here later this summer, as a course in the graduate school with all, I'm not criticizing, I'm saying that this is an awareness that, you know, there are reasons that people have beliefs. Those beliefs may need to be challenged, and they also need to be communicated in a way that people can perhaps begin to be receptive. If that's through changes in policy or politics, and that's the way individuals want to go, I think that's fine. I'm not passing judgment one way or another. I'm saying that we have a large number of individuals for a variety of reasons who have misperceptions about science. Sometimes those misperceptions are propagated by us, as we just heard from a colleague. Sometimes they're propagated because we haven't done a very good job of understanding where those disbeliefs come from and trying to make a better case for why it's important to embrace certain principles. And that may not be always possible, and that may be very Pollyanna on my part, but the goal here today is just to kind of raise your awareness. Most of you are aware that this is an issue, and that's why we're having this topic, this series of topics. And this is a toolkit for you to take a look at and familiarize yourself with over the course of this month, and see how it's going to help you be more effective in however in both your science and medicine undertakings, and how you'll be able to communicate more effectively to influence individuals one at a time. And that is how changes occur. So I think that's really the intention here. So why do so many reject scientific theories? So there are a number of thoughts about this. The Nobel laureate Randy Shechtman puts this to: attitudes are reinforced when leaders are only antagonistic to established facts. A 2012 study on conspiracy theories offered an explanation that psychologists found that conspiracy theorists can hold their beliefs in the face of contradictory facts because of a process called global coherence, by which subjects selectively choose to believe only those facts which support their worldview. And so in the same way, as I alluded to before, if you think that the government is really untrustworthy, then if they publish guidelines on vaccines, you may not be in favor of vaccines. That's not necessarily rational, and I'm not supporting that, but understanding that may help you better begin to try to communicate effectively to influence individuals who hold contrary views. So why accessible and easily understandable science communication is so important, and those were attributes that many of you highlighted: understandable, accessible, important, is to find common ground, even when an audience may have a very different opposing view, to align, influence, and impact perspectives. And that's the whole purpose of communicating science effectively. Maybe a little Pollyanna-ish, but it's good to be a little bit Pollyanna-ish. Okay, so communication in science, how do we go about it? So clearly it's more than just talk. It's our ears, it's being good listeners, our eyes, taking in information, using our emotional intelligence to understand perspectives, and also how we speak and present information. Part of it is new language acquisition. So here's a good cartoon that says, "Don't worry, I speak fluent teenage." So one of the challenges we have is to learn a variety of new languages and to reduce that language, which may in the form of jargon, to understandable terminology and understandable phrases that the average person who is less familiar with the topic in which you are a particular expert can actually speak. Even in our own communities, there's a challenge, right? We're not just talking about speaking to a lay audience. If we just look at the basic and clinical science divide and we get to the notion of cultural competency, we have to understand the perspective. So here are two divisions between basic science and clinical science. So in basic science, the rule of thumb is nobody ever arrives before 10. And in clinical science, especially in the surgical communities, early risers, your day is over at 7 a.m. Basic scientists devise experiments to test hypotheses, whereas in clinical science, a lot of what we do is informed by experiments of nature. That doesn't mean that we don't ask questions and devise experiments to test hypotheses. I direct the clinical research education program. That's what's the basis for that. But a lot of our observations are informed by, again, experiments of nature that serve the basis for asking questions. In basic science, it's largely about theoretical knowledge, when in clinical science, there's a greater emphasis on practical knowledge. Contemplating data versus acting on evidence. Duplication of data, unique cases, or N of 1 approaches, which is actually coming back to basic science in the realm of precision medicine. The unit of measure for basic science, and RO1, the unit of measure for clinical science, RVU. So having this divide and this different cultural context means, how do we effectively communicate even among scientific disciplines to gain perspective on each arena, is again a challenge for some of the principles and tools that you're going to be learning about over the next month to really engage colleagues effectively, especially in the realm of transdisciplinary research and team science. So there are a couple of quotes. Effective communication in science. In my experience and in the studies that I've looked at, if you really want to find common ground, you have to truly engage with the public and have a meaningful dialogue. Easier said than done. Again, the tools and principles we're going to be discussing will help to render that a little more feasible. Science education focuses too much on individual facts. It's much more important for the general public to have an understanding of the process, which I think is another reason for highlighting a couple of the individuals that we highlighted was they are trying to give the public an understanding of the process, perhaps without enough facts, but certainly the emphasis is not on the individual facts, as Bruce Alpert's published in Science. So there are a number of tools for effective communication. Some of them you may be familiar with. Language, simplicity of language, and the way in which your phraseology, the rhythm of the words, which has to do with gaining attention, the tone that you project. We're going to be learning about storytelling, and I'm going to show you a very brief TED Talk video which uses the principle of storytelling extremely effectively. Improv, I would recommend to all of you to try improv, which is a growing technique to really get you to enhance your critical thinking, thinking on your feet and responding in simple, succinct manner to a number of challenges that can occur in the improv theater technique. The use of pop culture, placing a context for your science in the context of pop culture, and I'll show you some examples, and a variety of other tools. We're going to be hearing about TED Talk principles and elevator talk principles, as well as pitches from colleagues in the next week or so. So the use of pop culture is one of the areas that Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson have sort of popularized, for better or for worse. And some of this has moved into the realm of science in movies, TV, and Netflix. I have friends who know nothing about science or medicine or clinical research who are now seem to know a lot about clinical trials from Fargo, because one of the protagonists actually participated in a clinical trial, and this has really raised their awareness of that. Actors playing scientists in movies, actors playing patients, Academy Award nominees and recipients for actors playing scientists, has a way of raising awareness of what these disciplines are all about, with, for better or for worse, but largely to raise awareness, which can be a positive thing. We talked about the use of pop culture, and the reason we highlighted some of those notable actors and actresses was because of their propensity to really try to communicate about science in their realm of interest and expertise. And then the use of pop culture, the use of analytic tools and heat maps in sports. Here's an example of looking at Stephen Curry, my favorite basketball player, where he shoots the variety of his shots, successful shots for the 2015-16 season, and in tennis matches where the effective stroke pattern frequency, really for people to understand about heat maps and gene expression is no different than the heat map they see in the weather report or in popular culture, and using popular culture as an entree to topics that people are already interested in from a lay perspective is a technique that many effective communicators have used to reach audiences on a common ground. So lastly, as scientists and individuals in medicine, we tend to give our presentations with background, supporting details, and then our results and conclusions. But a different suggested model when communicating with the public is really to talk about the bottom line and why it's important. And then the supporting important details, not all the details, that will help to drive home that bottom line. And so it's a little different way of thinking about how to communicate depending upon your audience. I'm going to end with showing you a TED Talk video from an environmental scientist who is, there's no way to get rid of the ad at the beginning. Who's terrific at storytelling and driving home the point of effective communication.
The city's first one-way street. Halfway along this street is the Royal Institution. And here in the 1800s and early 1900s, artists, poets, and scientists would engage with the public. Scientists would tell stories of their latest works, give live demonstrations of their latest discoveries. And the rich and wealthy from all over London would come and listen and see the wonder of science. In fact, such was the demand to get to these talks, and such was the crowds of horse-drawn carriages descending on Albemarle Street, that the Royal Institution had to make the street one way in order to avoid complete traffic chaos. Scientists were the hottest ticket in town. And for a time, there was a tangible connection between scientists and the public. But times change. Science is constantly changing. A new theory replaces an old one, and new knowledge fills a gap. And how scientists communicate also changed. Scientists began to spend more time researching and less time engaging with the public. More time became most, and then most became almost all. And gradually the connection between scientists and the public weakened. This is complicated by three barriers to science communication. The first is the language of science. It is objective. It has to be. It's complex to be clear. But this complexity and objectivity of scientific language means it's difficult for the public to care about it because it sounds cold and convoluted. And I'm a PhD student in science, and a few weeks ago I was working on a draft paper with my supervisor, and we were sending the drafts back and forth to each other, but he kept on pulling me up in areas where my scientific writing wasn't good enough standard, where I was being ambiguous, or I wasn't being clear enough, not giving enough detail, or where there was room for interpretation of what I was saying. There can never be room for interpretation for a scientist when they write, because that's how mistakes are made. At the end of the week, I was absolutely wrecked. And I also remember that I actually hadn't been in contact with my girlfriend for the entire week. So I said, I better send her an email. And it started off okay. And the first thing I wanted to tell her was that I wanted to tell her that I wanted to apologize for not having been in contact all week. But it didn't come out quite as I wanted. And then the next thing is I wanted to tell her how beautiful her eyes were, but I was kind of a bit afraid of her dad, and again that didn't come out as I wanted to. I wanted to reassure her that I wanted to hold her and that I could never let her go, but it just came out completely wrong. After that, then I wanted to tell her we had a strong bond, one that I hoped would come strong in the future, and then I wish that she would feel the same way as me, but again, that just came out a little bit askew. And then I signed off like this. Now, my girlfriend, she's not a scientist, and she calls things as she sees them, so this was her reply. So this was me communicating as a scientist, and I was unable to step away from the objective language and its complex nature. And as a love letter, it was completely useless because there was no emotional connection, and I was about as romantic as a block of cheese. So this is one of the ways that there's a barrier between how scientists communicate to each other and how they communicate to the public. The second barrier is that of context. When I hear the word model, this is what I think of. That's a model. That's an idealized representation of a process. But to everyone else, well, that's a model. And when I hear the word significant, I think of statistically significant. I think of a p-value less than 0.05. And I think of a difference in results that are beyond chance. To me, this is significant. To everyone else, this is significant. So that clash of context can also prevent scientists from communicating effectively with the public. And the last barrier is the amount of detail that we use as scientists. We need to use an awful lot of detail because we need to make sure that other scientists can replicate our work. And I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and one of the slides that went up was like this, and it was just packed full of detail. Now, I like detail, but even I couldn't handle all of this detail. And in fact, I only got as far as the heading, and then after the heading, I just basically wanted to have a look around to see what was at this talk, because that was more important. And then after that, well, I realized, I better check my phone to see what's happening on Facebook, and, see if I actually have any friends. And after that, I realized I was absolutely starving because I hadn't eaten all day. And, I reckon there was a really nice hotel in the conference style, so I figured they'd probably have some really nice food at the coffee break. And then I began to wonder, which would I rather fight, 50 dog-sized horses or one horse-sized dog? And the biggest thing that I actually got out of that slide on the introduction to wetlands was to research this fight when I got home. Instead of actually learning anything about wetlands, all I could think of was this big, massive dog. So this is another barrier between how scientists can communicate effectively with the public. And a few weeks ago, I found myself going over to a science communication competition where I would have to connect with scientists and the public at the same time. I would have to make sure that I got in enough scientific information, but that I didn't lose the attention and the understanding of the audience. I would have to do all of this without PowerPoint and in 3 minutes, no more. But I had in my head that communicating science to scientists and communicating science to the public, completely different languages. And how was I going to do this properly? Because all of my training had been in one language, the language of science. How was I going to speak the language of the people? And I needed to change. And I needed a tool to help me change. A tool that would allow me to connect with the audience. A tool to connect the scientists with the public. And I thought about it, and I remember that when I was a child, I loved stories. I could listen to the same story again and again and again every day and never get sick of it. And I would always have an emotional connection with the storyteller. And I didn't realize that was the tool that I needed. That I would tell a story and embed the science within the story. So excited to tell a story. How clear is the line between life and death? Everyone here has something in common, a beating heart which keeps us alive. If your heart stopped beating, that would be cardiac arrest, leading to death. What if you didn't need a beating heart to be alive? To answer this question, we must go on a journey all the way to the forests of northern Canada. But this isn't a story of fantasy or fairy tale. It does, however, involve a frog, the wood frog. And each winter the wood frog blurs the line between life and death. Unlike us, frogs are cold-blooded. Their body temperature closely follows the temperature of their environment. And seeing as the wood frog lives in such a cold environment, this presents a problem. But the wood frog has evolved a solution to live with the cold. Like Bear Grylls, the wood frog is tough. But unlike Bear Grylls, it's tough in real life. As the temperature drops below zero, the frog begins to freeze. First its legs freeze, then its head and chest freeze, until finally its heart freezes. No heartbeat, no pulse. It's in cardiac arrest. And it stays in this death-like state for weeks. And during these weeks, the frogs are just like ice cubes. You drop them on the ground, they just cling around. And in fact, they're so cold that they don't even respond to a kiss from a princess. But during the spring, something incredible happens. The frog begins to thaw out. Its heart starts to beat again, its lungs start to breathe again, until finally they're hopping around. But how can the wood frog cheat death like this? But why can't we survive freezing and thawing? Well, when the cells in our body freeze, they dehydrate. Water leaves the cell and freezes in the area around the cell. But with no water left on the inside anymore, cells collapse, split, and die. They can never regain their function. But the wood frog is different. It has an inbuilt safety mechanism. As its cells begin to freeze, some water leaves, but is replaced with glucose, which is a simple sugar that the frog makes as it freezes. This glucose combines with the remaining water inside the cell, keeping the inside unfrozen. So while all around the cell is frozen, the inside is protected in its natural, sugary antifreeze. So clearly the wood frog won't be going off sugar for Lent. Then, when the frog thaws out, water re-enters the cell, glucose leaves, and the cells resume their function. And this freeze-thaw adaptation allows the wood frog to survive, not by avoiding the cold, but by embracing it.
Okay, so I know we're a little over the hour, but I think, what would you take from this clipping?
I think we use humor quite a bit to keep the audience engaged and awake, right?
Humor?
Our story is old as we start making.
We're going to have a whole section devoted to storytelling. It's not a simple tool. Clearly, for preparing for a TED Talk, they do these over months. There are certain principles of TED Talks that we'll also learn about in addition to storytelling. But as you sat here, what other thoughts or feelings that were evoked by his conversation? It was relatable. It was a conversation, right? It wasn't just a lecture. It was a conversation. He, in a lot of the elements that you yourself brought in, he invited you into his living room, in a sense. And he touched you emotionally, something you could relate to. His humor, personal interactions with his girlfriend, but the kind of wonderment of the cold environment of the wood where the frog lives also was an environment that was almost magical. He was able to impart. So I think, and he very clearly delineated a topic that came up several times, the difference between communicating with like-minded individuals or people who are in science and medicine already versus those in the lay public. And what are some of the different approaches one needs? So I think it's a great example. You can look at the end at your leisure, and there are other good ones to highlight. But I think this kind of provides you an overview of the various topics that we're going to be addressing over the course of these sessions. As you know, next on Thursday, we're going to be having a talk on the use of social media for scientists and clinicians, pitching for career success. We'll have principles of TED Talks, how to incorporate those by Marie Norman from Pittsburgh. Empowering investigators to communicate with the community. We'll have storytelling as well as principles to enhance creativity and teamwork and collaborative research among people of like-minded or different disciplines, which is a challenge in and of itself, just as much as communicating with the lay public. So thank you very much for your attention. If there are questions, please feel free to call.